All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. Before we jump in, quick disclaimer. The views expressed by my co-host today are their personal views, and they do not represent the views of any organization with which the co-hosts are associated with. Nothing in the episode is construed or relied upon as financial, technical, tax, legal, or other advice. You know the deal. Now, let's jump into the episode.
Hey everyone, this episode is brought to you by Maverick Protocol, a suite of liquidity tools built around an innovative AMM. Maverick helps token projects, DAO treasuries, LPs, or basically anyone in DeFi shape their liquidity with efficiency and flexibility. How, you might ask? Stick around and you're going to be hearing about them more later. Now, on with the show. Welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. Today, we are going to be talking about order flow auctions, and I am super pumped for this episode. It's a very cool sort of on the Venn diagram of MEV and DEXs that we've been talking about in the season. Order flow auctions are squarely right in the middle of that. So in this episode, we start from a high level just to find what order flow auctions are. Then we go through some of the more nitty gritty designs decisions, such as the order types that they're designed for. So more generic, sort of broad-based order flow auctions, or more app-specific order flow auctions that might optimize for something like swaps. Permissioning, so who is allowed to participate in the auction, the information that's shared. Is it full info, partial info? When does that information get shared? And some of the more nitty-gritty design decisions. We talk about which components of the OFA should be on-chain versus off-chain and the centralizing impacts of that. We talk about what it takes to run a credibly neutral auction. And then finally, we move into intents and the improvement that intents have over transactions and the implications for how these OFAs are designed. So this is a really great episode. And without further ado, we'll just jump right in. All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. Today, I'm joined by my co-host, Dan. And today we're joined by Robert and Xin of Uniswap X and Flashbots/Swap. This is going to be a really fun one. And my hope is that we're going to get deep into the weeds a little bit. And we're going to be talking about order flow auctions or OFAs. And I thought we could actually just start sort of with a 10,000 foot definition of how you view like what an order flow auction is. Eventually, we're going to delve deep into the design space, maybe we could then sort of segue into where Uniswap X and Swap fit within that definition. So maybe Xin, I can pick on you to kick us off here.
Well, order flow auctions to me, as the name suggests, just means when there is order flow. And order flow, is just an array of orders, which right now typically means swaps, but it can also mean other things, transactions. And there are participants in the market who assign value or positive value to these set of transactions or swaps, and they have somehow a willingness to pay for the opportunity to interact with these orders. And then the order flow auction is just the auction for them to kind of bid on the opportunity to interact. That's my understanding of it.
That sounds right. And then ideally bidding with the proceeds of that auction typically going to the user who created the transaction or intent, or in some cases to the interface that originated it. I think generally, I think we think of OFAs it's not about something like the MEV boost auction, where the proceeds of the MEV are going to ultimately the proposer of the block on chain. Although I don't know if others would disagree with that limitation of the definition. But that's typically the kind of auction that determines what kind of MEV happens. And I see OFAs as kind of an escape valve for those.
Yeah, I think that's the helpful way to slice it. And there's a great piece on Frontier Research, which sort of has a 2x2 of sort of like maybe swaps versus more general transactions, and then execution, sort of like block space auctions. But Robert, maybe I could pick on you here because Suave, I'd love to get your sense of, we were talking a little bit beforehand. You sort of described Suave as sort of a platform for OFAs. So I think we all sort of get the concept of like an order flow auction, why order flow is valuable in the process of auctioning that off and returning that back to users, but would love to get a sense because there's already this like plethora of designs for order flow auctions, and they all sort of serve different purposes. So we'd love to just get your sort of sense of what the landscape looks like and where Swab fits, and then we can go down into some of the examples of some of the OFAs that exist today.
Yeah, so I thought that what Xin and Dan laid out is a really helpful starting point for a discussion. Order flow auctions originally talked about this type of auction which auction off the right to backrun a user's transaction, and where the proceeds of that auction would be paid back to the user. And so starting with specifically, Ethereum transactions, it's most easily conceptualized in the context of a trade, where the trade generates some MEV because it wasn't routed properly, and that MEV can be paid back to the user instead of just going to the miner or the validator instead. And since the time that idea of an order flow auction was generated, we have started to conceptualize other types of order flow auctions for more general forms of execution. So I think, Dan, you're referring to intents at some point where a user isn't making an Ethereum transaction specifically, but they're saying, hey, here is a signature saying I want to trade from USDC to ETH, and please fill this in the best way possible. There's many ways to do this. Usually they involve some form of competition among many different parties to give the users the best execution possible, which is where the auction part comes through. And Flashbots has created one concrete order flow auction, which works specifically with transactions called Mev Share. We can get into the details of that. But in the last year, we've seen a huge explosion of different types of order flow auctions. Ones that are more similar to Mev Share, so they're working with individual Ethereum transactions, but also order flow auctions which work with intents like Uniswap X, and I'm sure we'll get into the details of that, or other RFQ-based systems, other types of intent execution systems. And one of the things that we worry about here at Flashbots is that while we have really helped mitigate MEV by introducing these order flow auctions that pay MEV back to users, and that's a net good thing, we worry that we are centralizing the market in new places, largely like in these off-chain pieces of infrastructure that run these auctions. And our answer to this new form of centralization in the market is Suave, which is a platform where developers can create the order flow auctions and other types of MEV infrastructure as smart contracts on a decentralized blockchain with built-in credibility and privacy. I'm happy to get into the details of how that works, but at a high level, that's kind of how we think about order flow auctions at Flashbots and different types, and the motivation behind Suave as a platform for OFAs and the problem that we're trying to address in the market, which is moving this infrastructure which used to be run on chain off-chain, and introducing a new vector of centralization.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful, and that's a really good. I'm getting a little flashbacks to the MEV season we did with Hasu. We used to talk about sort of centralization whack-a-mole, which is sort of the game that you end up playing in MEV land. But I would love to get a sense, because maybe we could start with sort of the most straightforward definition of an order flow auction, where what we're talking about is just swaps, right? Something like that. I know Suave has a much more broad vision. Uniswap X is pretty laser focused on swaps. Would love to get a sense for you guys, maybe just starting there of, we talk about order flow auctions as the ability to aggregate, preferences, very non-specific sort of arbitrary preferences. I mean, how much of that do you see ultimately, like what's the sort of market share in between just swaps versus these sort of broad, more arbitrary preferences? Maybe just to start out, and how do you see that kind of shaking out? Because I'd love to start digging into this dynamic of like more general order flow auctions versus app specific ones.
I think today the majority of MEV does come from swaps. A large majority of it is either ARBs or sandwiches. There's a small amount which is liquidations, and then a small amount which is just weird stuff that's happening on chain, which is kind of hard to quantify. A bunch of NFT stuff, sometimes gaming, sometimes just odd things on chain. And so to that end, like a OFA that addresses swaps is going to address the majority of the market space. I will say that it is not immediately clear to me that this is going to stay the same into the future. I would expect swaps to be a very, very large and dominant and important category, but I think MEV finds a way and is oftentimes popping up in unexpected places. As an example, there's a lot of MEV on friend.tech, which like kind of looks like swaps, but it is maybe can be conceptualized a little bit differently too. And so who knows where it'll come in the future? Maybe a gaming use case, maybe something else. But today it is definitely the majority of MEV is coming from swaps. That is for sure. Was there another part of your question, Michael, or did that address it?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I would just love to maybe Xin as sort of a more app specific approach, which focuses exclusively on. I'd just love to get a sense of like the pros and cons for folks out there who are listening. Maybe to be really overly simplistic, the way that I've sort of thought about it is if it's app specific, you can really tailor the user experience, as opposed to if you make it more general, then your total addressable market is much larger, right? Just sort of broadly how I would classify the trade-off, but would love to get a sense from the two of you of like, just as developers of the two different styles, like how you both think about it.
I might flip that around, because in fact, again, I think like more than half of MEV, I would say, is DEX related. So in some ways, actually, I think it's not necessarily the addressable market is a lot larger, but actually you do have a lot more power once you go to more generals. But yeah, but I can give thoughts after. I'm curious for Xin's thoughts too.
Yeah, I mean, I think by definition, if you take a more inclusive approach, by definition, the addressable market is definitely larger. I think the main reason that we have taken a very focused approach is just we believe that's what we specialize in, that's what we are good at, and like Uniswap for its history has always almost exclusively done swaps only. Like we never try to branch out into lending or other like DeFi stuff. No stable coin, no anything else, just swaps. And so since right now there's so many MEV and other execution related problems with the way swaps happen on chain, I feel like Uniswap X is just a nice way to sort of improve the user experience here. And right now, yes, the maybe that's like more than half of the MEV problem, but you never know. As Robert said, like maybe in the future there's a ton more activities, and I would love to see that. Right, I think that's also a good scenario for me if in the future crypto industry is way more than people swapping tokens. There's like a lot more activity happening. But I think right now. We're still taking a somewhat more specialized approach, smaller addressable market. I think the upside is you can just focus on doing one thing really, really well. So like there's only a few parameters that we have to think about, even though that's still a hard problem. But at least we don't have to consider, like 100 different corner cases when it comes to NFT minting or lending liquidations or like other kind of activities. So that's the upside, I would say.
I think one other interesting thing here, and would be curious how you all think about this, Xin and Dan, over on the Uniswap side of things, is that you have a revealed preference for people to, I think, participate in some types of OFAs, which are swap related, but not in the way that you might immediately think. And so there's like a type of market participant which wants to backrun like someone who is adding liquidity for a new token, as an example, and is like willing to pay for the rights to do that. And that is swap related, but it's not the OFA that you would design for something like that is not a competition just to fill the user at the best price, because it's conditional on something else happening on chain, or copy trading also. So I think in some ways like this question depends on where you draw the boundary of swap also. Like, does that address the same type of swap as Uniswap X? Probably not.
Right. So I was going to say, I've been generally a partisan for let's try to solve the simpler version of the problem, where it's just ordinary retail swappers just swapping with each other and with market makers. So sort of a batch auction or something more like Uniswap X, just because it's simpler and it's like an example of a problem that is very large. But I absolutely agree with Robert that I think one of the reasons, not only are there's a lot of like really long tail stuff, then there's a lot of kind of middle tail that is deeply entangled with swapping. Swapping on chain exchanges for something, doing that atomically with user orders is, where exactly does that fit in terms of like, is that just pure swapping? And then, stuff like liquidation auctions, where things, often doing a lot of other complicated stuff on chain does involve a swap. And so, so I think we end up deep in MEV territory. And, I know this is the DEX season, and you've already had a MEV season that Robert's been on. But so I think we can focus on the DEX parts here, but I do think it really bleeds into the rest of MEV for sure.
It absolutely does. And especially the point, like a huge part of that season as well was just the idea of returning MEV to users, which is, Robert, as you stated, sort of the explicit purpose of order flow auctions from your perspective. Hey everyone, wanted to take a quick second to shout out this season's partner, Maverick Protocol. Now, many of you probably know Maverick as an innovative AMM, which they are, but in reality, they're a lot more than that as well. Maverick is a suite of tools for DeFi users and builders that allows them to put liquidity where it will get the most work done. Since Maverick launched in March, they have been gobbling up market share, and at the time of this recording, which is the end of September, on a trailing 7-day volume basis, Maverick is now a top 3 DEX by volume, and they support over 50% of the volume on the L2 ZK Sync era chain. Maverick enables LPs and token pairs to process higher volume with limited TVL, which allows them to support some of the highest levels of capital efficiency for LSTs like Wrap-Steth. Another very cool feature is something called Maverick Boosted Positions. So that allows protocols looking to bootstrap their token liquidity to target the shape of liquidity of any token pair with surgical precision. Maverick is backed by some of the leading institutions in crypto: Founders Fund, Pantera, Coinbase Ventures, Binance Labs. They are all backing Maverick in their vision to revolutionize the next generation of DeFi dApps and helping them build their liquidity in all market conditions. Click the link at the bottom of this episode. Let them know that I sent you. Thanks, guys. I would also be curious, just because we've talked about this a little bit in past episodes, but you just mentioned sort of the on-chain, off-chain component. I would be curious, one idea that we're sort of poking at for DEXs this season is which parts of a DEX are important to be completely on-chain and, decentralized, and which parts are we like, maybe actually this part of the DEX is more okay to be off-chain, and would be curious to understand like how you think about that from the perspective of order flow auctions, like which parts of an OFA like need to be or should be on chain and decentralized from your perspective.
And Dan, how did you think about what parts of Uniswap X to have on chain? Maybe let's start there.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to start, and I'm sure Dan will have other thoughts after that. So I think Uniswap X is a combination of a few things. The protocol that was mostly described in the white paper is actually mostly on chain, and it's mostly about sort of the declining the Dutch order that happens. And then for us to like create a nice user experience and to correctly parameterize these orders, where to start the decay, how long it decays, where to end the decay, we have sort of for now attached a off-chain piece to the start of it, so that we ask a bunch of people what's your best quote for this order, and then using those quotes we sort of say, okay, maybe like this is where we should start and this is where we should end, and that's technically not part of the protocol itself, but it's part of the bootstrapping, and now it's sort of relied upon by the protocol to function. So I think there's like an ideal world where everything is on chain and everything is permissionless and things goes out to everyone. But on the other hand, there's also a realistic version where we have to start something and we have to see if things work. So that's where I'd say we are now, and we're definitely things are on the roadmap to make it more decentralized and more like the version that we envisioned. But yeah, right now, just for realistic concerns, we have some off-chain pieces there.
That's right. So I think of Uniswap X as sort of I think of Uniswap X generally not as an order flow auction protocol or anything, but really it's an order format for signing intents. It's a format for these orders. As currently implemented, I think I see it as this amalgamation of two order flow auctions, one of which is a Dutch auction, one of which is a sealed bid first price auction. That's run off chain, and I do think one of the reasons they do the sealed bid off chain auction is because of just limitations of what you can do on chain, because of just the latency of for instantaneous somehow. It might be a lot easier to get optimal price using the Dutch auction, as well as about some parameterization around like, how do we actually find the price discovery around how do we find the right starting price for a Dutch auction, which is a limitation of the Dutch auctions have. But yeah, I think there are other kinds of auctions that you could do, and I think You could imagine a sealed bid batch auction. You could imagine a second price auction. And all of these are, I think, ways that you can just generally do an auction. And here, when combined with Uniswap X, you can turn them into an order flow auction.
Why do you need an off-chain RFQ in order to choose where the starting price is?
I mean, what's the alternative? Alternative would be just you could just pick a starting price, right? Or maybe you could do something just based on looking on chain. But what's the alternative for picking where you start at Dutch auction? You have to start it somewhere, right?
Yeah, you have to start it somewhere. Why not use the top pool for a given pair on chain, or use you all invested quite a bit at Uniswap in routing as an example. So you certainly have a perspective on a price that you could execute a user's order on chain. So why not use that?
Yeah, well, more or less, it does use that, but then it as a fallback, as ultimately if that's what it sets the price to if nobody's able to provide a price improvement on it, right? It shouldn't remind me if that's exactly. I may be mischaracterizing a little bit there.
Yeah, so I think that's whatever you can do on chain. That's sort of the worst case, right? And you only need this system if you can do better than what you can already do. And also I think to put things into context, we're working with basis point here. We don't have 100% potential improvement, and we just decay 1 point each second. It's really you decay 1 or 2 basis points, or maybe less than that. And so I think it's important to get really accurate, really fast, and that's why you sort of need this RFQ system. Otherwise, you you pick 1 point and you decay, and no one takes your order, and the next second or next block you are way past your potential, right? So that's what
I see. So you need some starting point, and you're choosing an off-chain RFQ as a way to get a very accurate price, which you're worried about. You need that because you need to decay that price over time, and you want to just start at a place which is within reason, correct?
Yeah. Ultimately, in order to get the best latency you can, get the best price while still preserving latency. You could just do a really slow batch auction, Dutch auction with a low decay to get a pretty good rate. Although you're still gonna have some imprecision due to block latency. But yeah.
And then so you're using this off-chain RFQ to get a price, and the only thing that happens on chain is essentially the settlement of the user's intent. Is that right? All liquidity off chain, or is amalgamated by searchers on chain?
Well, there's still the Dutch auction that happens, right? It's just there's 2 auctions. The first auction decides where the Dutch auction is going to start and end, and then the Dutch auction happens, and whoever fills it first fills.
Yeah, I guess my point being that this doesn't leverage just Uniswap LP pools. It'll either take whatever the off-chain RFQ liquidity is and settle that way, or it'll take whatever your solvers find as the best route on chain in the case that it's not filled through the off-chain RFQ.
That's right. It's not limited or partial to any particular pool or Uniswap to on-chain Uniswap liquidity.
Right, but just to be clear, in either case, people are free to use Uniswap liquidity, right? As long as they're competitive, it's always, in fact, best to use it.
Yeah. How did you all think about the decision to put your flow through an off-chain RFQ first? Because it's, I think, a pretty significant change to the market structure that you have a handful of market makers which get, as I understand, the first right to execute users' trades now, right? They can go through the GDA, and if someone gives a price improvement of, I think, a 1%, correct me if I'm wrong, then they can execute that, but it is initially permissioned to a smaller set. So can you walk me through what your considerations were and how you thought about moving to this market structure?
I think first of all, it's definitely still in beta. So as we try to roll this out, we're still onboarding these market makers. But on the other hand, as you mentioned, there's a handful of them. These handful of them are practically 100% of them. If you look at the volume they process and the competitiveness there are. So I would say if your best interest or if your intent as the market structure designer is to get the best execution for your for your users, then what you really need is the competitiveness, not the numbers, right? And so you have the best NBA team by putting together 5 players, not to just increase the number of players, but to have the 5 best players. And I think as I said, like this is not exactly where we want to be long term, but I think it's a pretty good bootstrapping strategy, just because it kind of suffices to have a handful of them that's very, very good. And then we can think about how we can kind of open the gate to everyone who has the interest to compete in this system.
Yeah. The way I'd put it, and I've talked about this with Mike in previous episodes, is that I think the essential imperative, in my view, is to move from transaction space to intent space, to move from orders that are coming from the Uniswap interface are meant to be executed on a specific pool using a specific route and are encoded as an Ethereum transaction. Because an Ethereum transaction, as Robert will tell you, is not a very flexible thing. It is hard to program around an Ethereum transaction. It can't be like bundled together with a bunch of other ones. You can't do a lot of math necessarily on it. You can't easily execute it atomically with other things within an Ethereum transaction. Or at least, it adds a lot of complexity to try to do these things. Whereas intents are much more flexible. And Uniswap X order expresses an intent, you can do a lot more things with it. And I think that's just essential for the future of DEX. I think it's essential for something like Uniswap V4, where a lot of pools on Uniswap V4, I think, are actually going to a lot of ideas for how to do lever reducing hooks, for example, I think are going to depend on having orders expresses that aren't necessarily just like locked to a particular pool, but in fact like can be executed on any of these pools, for example. Now again, I think the current design is one way that you can, I think, get potential improvement on orders using intents. But again, really, like, since the order format is not tied to that particular one, I think that's the more important piece of it to me.
Sorry to hijack the conversation a little bit, Michael.
No, you're fine, man. No, I do want to hear your perspective, though. I'm very curious, and then I do want to just ask you guys some of my basic questions about just how to construction auction, or like how you think about it. But I'd be curious to get your take, Robert, before we get into some of the more nitty gritty.
Yeah, I think with all these things, there's a general trend of taking more and more work that used to happen on chain and moving it off chain in order to give users some sort of MEV mitigation. And we're concerned about that in Flashbots and centralizing the MEV supply chain, centralizing critical parts of crypto. And so I think the question that we need to ask ourselves, the 4 of us on this podcast today, but the entire industry, is how we get to that point where we're giving users best execution without accidentally centralizing all of the critical parts of the MEV supply chain along the way. There's a broad design space, and would be curious also, and Xin and Dan, how you all are thinking about the roadmap for X and decentralization and what you all have on the horizon here.
I have maybe somewhat of a random thought, but I guess as a question, I do wonder how, Robert, you think about things like private RPCs. Are they sort of, would you consider them more of an exclusive setting? One thing we try to, this separate research that I was doing, I was wondering if everything switched to a private RPC, or if some varying percentage of swaps switch to a private RPC, whether it will be more centralizing or less centralizing in a way. And the conclusion I think I came to was that it will be less centralizing in the sense that there will be less extractable value, assuming people honor their sort of social contract in the private RPC setting. So there's less to extract, and so naturally, even the best guys cannot extract more than the worst guys, and so you don't have this like winner takes all situation. But it will be more centralizing in the sense that now you have a barrier to entry, right? And so now, suppose there's a new guy who's much better than everyone else, he cannot get any flow because he's not connected to any of these private RPCs, and there's no deals between them, and yeah. So I do wonder, how or have you thought about it? And if so, what was your thoughts on private RPCs, and And do you think that's a direction that we should or will move towards?
It's a good question, and I appreciate you asking it, Xin. So are private RPCs more centralizing than like essentially centralized intent infrastructure in general is how I'm taking the question. And I think I think it's hard to say which is more centralizing than the other. I think in practice they're both very centralizing. If I wanted to come to some numerical amount that would tell me which was more centralizing than other, I'd probably look at like the economic value that flows through these things. And to that end, I think there could be I think right now, I would expect these things to be about equivalent. I would worry more in the future that the centralized intent-based services end up becoming more centralizing because they start at a point in the supply chain, which is before private RPCs too. And so private RPCs may be obviated in a year if everyone is using intents, because the primary way that users transact on the chain will not be through Ethereum transactions. It'll be by expressing your intent with a signature that someone else executes on your behalf. And in that world, you don't have much of a need for private RPCs.
Well,
but I think
now,
I will say I think you have like a.
Sorry, you guys still need a private RPC for whoever's filling and whoever's submitting the transaction that includes those intents, right? Like, so that the intents can't be like plucked out of their transaction and sent and done shared somewhere else. Like somehow the block still needs to get built out of other people's transactions, maybe, unless the builder is just operating directly on intents.
Yeah, that is a good point. That is a good point. So private RPCs will still be around. I think the caveat to that may be that like the extractable value, assuming that your private RPC actually holds is credibly neutral and holds up to the properties that it says, will be a lot lower at the private RPC point than it would at the intent centralized service point, or whatever we're calling it, the intent point of the supply chain. Both of them concern me a lot for what it is worth. So I don't want to minimize any concerns around private RPCs also. And I would like all of that infrastructure to also be built on Swav too.
All right. Guys, I want to get into almost obviously, when we talk about something like auctions, I think it's very simple if you're not in the weeds to be like, oh yeah, you run an auction and, the highest bidder gets, X, Y, Z thing that you're auctioning off. But there's just almost like infinite sort of permutations, right, of different, auctions that exist. And I would love to get a sense of, when you're going through actually constructing an auction, what are some of the design decisions that end up making their way into the final product? What are some of the different levers that you pull? I've been waiting for 4 episodes to ask Dan why he loves Dutch auctions so much and why they find their way into virtually everything that this man designs. But yeah, I would just be very curious, almost, treat me like a 5-year-old and I'm looking at something like Uniswap X or one of the maybe Mev Share, for instance, from Flashbots. And it's all right, what are the different, what are the different types of auctions that exist and what are some of the design decisions that end up running through your head as the implementer?
I can answer on Dutch auctions if that's.
I want to know. Yeah, I got to know.
Yeah. Well, for me, yeah, I think when you're reaching for something for price discovery, particularly for things that are illiquid or don't, where an oracle doesn't exist on chain. What I generally like auctions just as a method of price discovery, and I think Dutch auctions are uniquely well suited as a just off the shelf solution for price discovery on a blockchain, because ultimately, if you have an English auction, for example, you have to have censorship resistance basically over this. You have a long enough period to have censorship resistance to get enough bids in, which you also need on Dutch auctions, but there's sort of a limit to the amount of value that can be extracted by a censorer for a period there. And then you also need in an English auction, ultimately the number of bids could be a lot higher. The number of bids that actually have to at the chain. Whereas one nice thing about a Dutch auction, just gas efficiency wise, is that because prices start high and you only actually have it finish when the auction when transaction goes on. You don't have as many transactions. It's a lot cheaper in terms of gas on chain. And then finally, for on-chain auctions, why I like Dutch auctions is once the auction is the bid also happens at the exact time that the auction completes. So you can do a lot of other things potentially at the moment of the bidder at the time that the auction completes, can do a lot of other things. So if you think a Uniswap X order that has gone to a Dutch auction, at the time, like that bidder actually gets a place on chain, they can also arb something on chain atomically or something like that. As opposed to if you had like a lot of bids that had to be on chain, and then potentially canceled as new developments happened. So yeah, so I think it's just uniquely well suited for the on-chain environment. I would actually say I'm not a big fan of Dutch auctions outside of on-chain. I think like actually English auctions or sealed bid second price auctions are better and from an auction theory standpoint in a lot of situations. But on-chain and Dutch auctions are equivalent to a sealed bid first price auction rather than a second price auction. So in theory, but I think from an auction theory perspective, I don't love them as much. But just in terms of on-chain implementation, which I think is just really important. So that's my pitch for Dutch auctions as an off-the-shelf price discovery solution. And I should say, I think Dutch auctions for MEV as a way to implement an OFA aren't original to Uniswap X or us. I think there's an idea generally for like an escalator fee algorithm that I know Flashbots had been thinking about, and some others in the Ethereum space have been thinking about it, including as a core protocol feature. And I think it's cool because you could build it was an alternative to basically the 1559 auctions that ended, or second price auction basically ended happening for as a way to handle gas price. But it would do it in a way that potentially could actually return more of the MEV to users that they created.
It's the first again, it's the first version. We intend to iterate on it. So when we were sort of thinking about the design, we didn't really exhaustively survey every single auction format and like do a comparison or anything. I think the things in mind are, first of all, when you have a repeated game, a lot of these auctions kind of just give you the same equilibrium results. And what you want is sort of ease of integration and implementation, which I think, like sealed bid first price auctions are pretty easy to do. And the Dutch auctions are, as Dan mentioned, very suitable for blockchain environment because it minimizes sort of needed communication, and communication on blockchains are super expensive and all that. So we sort of just picked the easiest format, and we kind of analyzed the potential strategies people can use based on these formats, and we sort of went over the corner cases, and we think, okay, maybe we covered the ground more or less. I think there's a lot that we can potentially do on top of what we have right now. Like you can imagine allowing sort of batching of bids or batching of orders, or I think you can allow different type of bids, like conditional bids or so on. So yeah, a lot to be experimented and discovered in the future. But yeah, I think to start, we just pick something that's easy to use.
I'll jump in real quick with considerations that we had with MevShare. When we were thinking about developing MevShare, we talked to a bunch of wallets. This was quite some time ago, and essentially all of them told us that they had no appetite to implement intent-based execution. Essentially, like they wanted any OFA that we built to be backwards compatible with regular user transactions. And at the time, there was much less appetite from our good friends at the application layer to use private RPCs is how I would frame it, to ask users to switch to private RPCs. And so it didn't seem like at the time developing an OFA, which is based on signatures, was really, really compelling in the absence of us, since Flashbots doesn't operate a front end like Uniswap does, as an example. So we needed it to be backwards compatible. We needed it to support MEV redistribution for regular transactions. Interestingly, you can use MevShare for other types of things, forwards compatible with other types of orders, like UniX orders. That's an aside. We also wanted it to be permissionless for searchers. So anyone in the world should be able to search on the flow that goes through MevShare. And we didn't want to enshrine a single block builder. There are variants of order flow auctions that are that could be closer to a builder, but we wanted to make sure that you could use multiple different block builders and have a more healthy, decentralized builder market with MevShare. And if you take those as your constraints in designing an OFA, I think you come to roughly MevShare, although you could do it with different privacy settings too. So that's how we thought through the design of MEV-Share and how we ended up coming to the design that we did.
Yeah. It's just fun. Even, when doing a little bit of research for this episode, there was some sort of counterintuitive lessons. And I don't know, when you hear the word auction, maybe you think in your head sort of this like canonical guy with like a gavel, and it's like, do I hear 500 or 600 or whatever? But there are tons of different types of auctions that just occur in the real world that have very different parameters based on how much information is known at the time in between your bids, and when whatever gets released. And like payment for order flow would be in TradFi is a really good example of a very different type of auction than the one that might be happening in your head, where bids are submitted well ahead of time and exact information isn't necessarily known. And even when I was looking into sort of the OFA design space within, within our world, within crypto here, there was like, even just for something like permissioning, right? Like who should be allowed to participate in an auction? My immediate, gut take was that the more people, the better, right? The more competitive the pricing is going to be. But then you also end up, there's kind of like this concept of winner's curse and suffering from adverse selection, because the people that win that auction might be doing it, they might be pricing it incorrectly, and sort of the more optimistically and sometimes unintelligently you price it, the more disproportionately you will sort of win. So I don't know if all the three of you, having thought through many different types of auctions and scenarios, if there are other sort of funny lessons that you've taken away either from permissioning, or when information gets revealed to participants, or like sort of the strategy for or sort of like bid selection or settlement or whatever it is. But would love to, I don't know if there were any like sort of something that was sort of surprising to you from a design perspective in OFAs, or we could just sort of proceed into where intents, because we've talked about the limitations of the transaction on Ethereum, but I would love to get into intents. But I don't know if there are any sort of surprising lessons that you've taken from designing auctions over the years.
I'll let Dan or Shin talk to things like winner's curse and adverse selection and some of the more hardcore auction theory stuff. I will say that one anecdote that I have, which was surprising to me at the time, is how even like a relatively large sized pool of competitors can collude to keep prices down in auctions. So the anecdote is that when Uniswap v3 launched almost 2 years ago, it was very challenging for searchers to integrate. And you all also launched it without that much of a lead time for the market. And so it kind of just dropped. A bunch of liquidity migrated to it. And a lot of people then were trading on Uniswap v3, whereas a month before, the primary amount of volume on chain was going to v2 and things like old curve pools and whatever. And that meant that for a period of time, there was an extremely small pool of searchers who were able to arb Uniswap v3 pairs. And if you were a searcher at the time, the amount that you had to bid in the auction for Uniswap v2 arbs was something like 95 to 99%, because it was a really competitive market that was spread out across the entire world. And for Uniswap v3, even when you had something like a dozen searchers who could arb Uniswap v3, they managed to arbitrarily keep the price down in the auction to pay only something like 60% of the value of the arb to the miner in MEV-Geth. And that was quite surprising to me, how long a collusion ring could go on with how large of a pool of bidders were in that collusion ring too. And it was within their incentive. The other funny part about this that I'll drop as an anecdote really quick is what would happen is a new bot would come online and start arbing Uniswap v2, and people would go to the Flashbots Discord and like just yell at addresses, say like, hey, 0x, babe or dead, you are arbing Uniswap v3, like if you don't come and join my collusion ring, I am going to grip trigger you, push your profits to zero, you moron, you don't need to be bidding all of this to the miner at the time, we can work together here, something like that. And people would find each other this way. They would like check the Discord, and this actually worked for some time. So the takeaway of that, I think, is that
wasn't there something like there were people who would alternate even and odd blocks, or they'd alternate like every few blocks or something.
Yeah. They would do something like, there was some probabilistic way, I forget how exactly it was done, but some probabilistic way that like you would have an even distribution of the arbs at a certain point of profit for v3. I didn't hear the even odd blocks thing, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were 2 participants if they did that. Anyway, takeaway here just was for me that collusion finds a way, and it works with a larger set of people than you might expect.
Man, that's a great anecdote. Do you ever any like theories for how they were coordinating? Was it just over the Flashbots Discord? Everyone was just like yelling at each other.
Michael, I don't need a theory. They're doing it on Discord in broad daylight. Like, people would post addresses and transaction hashes and say, like, please DM me, like, let's keep bribes down, blah, blah, blah.
Oh my God. That's so funny. Man. That's really interesting. Xin, I don't know if you have anything or we can go into intense.
Oh, I was going to say interesting social coordination use case. I don't know if you guys were following the ETH research forum, but I think someone posted something about searcher cooperation or something. I wonder, it looks like a cool technical post, but I wonder it will evolve into weird use cases at some point. Maybe I'm misunderstanding that post, but it definitely, you know, it rings a bell now that you you mentioned this use case. But in terms of surprises, I don't think there's a ton. I think maybe, as you said, yeah, like the optimal number of participants in an auction, if your objective is to maximize the proceeds of the auction, is maybe not infinity, is like an unconfirmed surprise to me. Like that being a possibility to start, you know, intuitively, I just thought, you know, the more the merrier. But then the more I think about it, the more like I'm like, oh, maybe it's not infinity. Maybe it's, you know, 100 or something, or not even 100. But there's also an argument for, you know, maybe best execution is not the only thing that we're trying to optimize for, and in that case, you know, that optimal number will change.
I've got, sorry, 2 more questions for you here, and then Dan, I'll turn it over to you to talk about intents. But something I was curious about is how does when the information gets revealed impact the pricing of that information? And what I'm referencing here is, like, you know, I think about the EV, the sort of expected value of this information. There's like an ordering component, and then there's a signal component. So like, if I have this information, then that's valuable to me. And those are kind of the 2 components into how much you might bid on a given, you know, block or bit of order flow or whatever it is. And I would imagine, like, if that gets revealed to all the participants, suddenly the signal portion of that order flow is like, well, this is now available to all the participants of this auction, and that isn't super valuable to me, as opposed to, you know, if that information wasn't necessarily revealed, then you'd sort of be factoring that in. So I would just love to get a sense of, I have the intuitive feeling that, like, when information gets revealed in an auction is very important to the outcome, but I'd be curious from your perspective whether or not that's actually true.
I think, as you said, right, there are auctions where bids are placed before anything is revealed, or bids are placed before the thing even happens, right? And there are some auctions where bids are placed when the transaction is signed and you send a executable into the mempool, and then people will send bids. I think those are very different, and depending on exactly who you send the actual intent to, they will assign different value to the thing. Like, suppose there's 2 cases. Case 1 is you give the exact same set of order flow to someone, and they have the exclusive right to, like, you know, put bundles around the swaps or do whatever they want with them on chain. But before you do that, you tell everyone else that you're going to do it. And the second case is you only give it to them, and you don't tell anyone else, and they are responsible for, like, constructing the orders and do what they say, what they see fit. And obviously the second one is going to be worth more, because there are a lot of actions that people can take outside of directly interacting with the orders, right? They can they can do things on centralized exchanges, or try to like front run, back run, or do other things. So yeah, in general, I think that's like a pretty helpful. I don't know if it's a exhaustive dichotomy, but it's a pretty helpful framework to think about these things.
Again, call back to the MEV season we did. There was this term popped up a couple of times, like auction extractable value, actually, as opposed to maximum extractable value. And I guess like one of the problems that like I've sort of thought about as well, just in terms of an order flow auction outside of the strict design, is how do you host one that's credibly neutral? And in a permissionless environment, which many of these order flow auctions are, like, really basic question of how do I make sure the auctioneer isn't actually participating in the auction as well, in addition to many other sort of concerns that participants might have. So I'd just be curious, for maybe all of you, like, how do you think about hosting like credibly neutral auctions, especially in a more permissionless environment?
I think Robert could talk a lot about especially the trusted execution environments. But I want to point out, I think it's maybe early for this in order flow auctions, but I think Robert's also seen a lot in terms of what is possible in the relay market, or what relays could do in the MEV boost auction. So I'd be curious for his thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, so there's a lot here. In the MEV boost auction, I'm curious if you're referring to something in particular, Dan. I think like what immediately comes to mind is that, and you can tell me if you're thinking something else, is that relays have sort of a privileged position to be able to say what block wins, or to act on the information within blocks that builders are sending them to like update their bids faster, or what are you specifically referring to?
Yeah, I'm thinking of just the ability of a relay, in theory, a dishonest relay, to penny like another bidder's bid, right? They know exactly what the other bidders are bidding, so they know exactly how much they'd have to bid to win.
Yeah, exactly. So the relay right now is unfortunately sort of like a second price auction in some ways, which is why searcher builders are as powerful as they are. One of the reasons why searcher builders are as powerful as they are. I think, luckily, I think we've gotten to the point where the majority of relays or blocks that are going through are from neutral relays that don't run builders or aren't integrated as a builder. But it is a worry that I have, where you have a more integrated builder relay that is accepting external blocks and then using those external blocks to immediately penny on top of them and win the MEV boost auction. That's one of the reasons why we want to move the auction in MEV boost on-chain, or not on-chain, but within the Ethereum protocol too, to obviate the role of relays and like obviate the ways that you could penny or mess with other bids. At the very least, leveling the playing field in some way, and ideally implementing a sealed bid auction instead of this public auction that exists today.
And did you want to talk as well about ways to implement credibly neutral auction infrastructure?
Yeah, so that's one thing we think about here at Flashbots a lot. We've been concerned with decentralizing Flashbots ever since we decided to build this off-chain centralized infrastructure, to Shin's point earlier today, and ever since we saw this trend coming of off-chain infrastructure is going to become increasingly important to Ethereum and have an increasing amount of economic value going through it. The way that we're thinking about decentralizing today and how you run these credibly neutral auctions is creating a platform which we call Suave, where you can define the rules of your auction as a smart contract, and the execution of that smart contract happens within what is called a trusted execution environment. So this is a piece of hardware which is designed in such a way that even the operator, the person who physically has the hardware, can't tamper with or see what's going on inside of it. So you know that a piece of code is running as intended within a trusted execution environment, and you know that you have privacy with them too. So developers can define their order flow auctions, or like a MEV boost relay, or a builder, in some sort of intent service within a smart contract on top of Suave. And when a user wants to use that, what the smart contract's execution dictates will be loaded into an SGX and executed within that SGX. And so that gives you the credibility of a trusted execution environment. It gives you privacy, so no one can see the orders. And critically, what it also allows is for anyone in the world to be able to run these trusted execution environments and execute users' orders instead of relying on a Flashbots or some other trusted third party to do this type of execution. So that's how we're trying to provide like general infrastructure for credibly neutral and private auctions, and remove the trust that you need today in trusted third parties in order to run these things. Because to your point, Michael, I think it's very hard sometimes to tell if auction extractable value is being extracted. I think it's really interesting. It's not in the domain of crypto, but it took the Department of Justice years of collecting data in order to come to the conclusion that Google and their ad auction platform was messing with their auctions. And the contention is that they were extracting auction extractable value. So it can be very difficult, I think, to tell whether auctioneers are putting their finger on the scales in some way.
It's funny you brought up the Google example. I think that was the very first thing that we talked about in that MEV season was Google and their AdWord auctions. So I think this would be I'd love to close on the idea of intents. So I know, Dan, that was something that you were very interested in. So maybe if you could just sort of preface us with sort of the seismic shift that we're seeing in terms of the sort of Ethereum transaction to a more intense shaped world, and like where that belongs and fits into this whole order flow auction discussion.
Yeah. So I think order flow auctions are actually a perfect example of the kind of thing that I think intents are really useful for. So in a transaction-based world, if a user is trying, signs and sends an Ethereum transaction to trade on, say, a particular Uniswap pool, they create potentially some MEV from doing that. Maybe some MEV from being possibly front run, maybe some MEV from just being back run on it. But the way to capture, if you try to capture that MEV, you have to basically create a new transaction, back run that other transaction. And that's a very lossy process. You have a lot of transaction fees on extra transaction fees being done. You have extra gas being paid for this. And you have fees being paid to LPs for like this trade being done in both directions on the pool that actually sort of nets out to neutral. When ultimately economically what's supposed to be happening there is that the swapper is supposed to be swapping is basically swapping with a market maker. They're swapping with somebody who's back running them, who's offering to back run them. At least in the case of like back run MEV. And so that's what how existing OFAs that have to work around the transaction model. So MEV share, Flashbots MEV share is a great example, and we could talk more about exactly how that works. But it's an auction to basically be the back runner in this case. But my point is, I think it's a fairly leaky way to do this, and it means you actually miss out on potentially a lot of possible price improvement that you could get if you actually had an intent model where all I'm doing is I'm saying I want to trade, and the auction is actually just the right to basically submit a transaction that fills my intent. And you could just trade against me, or you could fill it on chain. But basically we don't actually have to go through this multi-step process because this is inefficient and that when done on chain because you can do it in intent space. Yeah, Robert, I don't know. Do you want to? Robert and I have been going back and forth on this for a while, but I think he sort of has a similar view in general. But yeah, I could talk more about MEV share.
No, I think you summarized it well, Dan. I think you do want to move to intent space. I think there's a lot more you can do with that. I think it's probably better UX for most people. I think, like, again, the trick with this is just moving to intent space in a way that doesn't end up centralizing the MEV supply chain. And don't have anything more to add than that. I think you summarized it well.
And yeah, I think it totally makes sense, by of course, that like MEV share and other OFA actions that were designed around the way that Uniswap. I think it's Uniswap's fault, more or less, that transactions work this way, where it's actually hard to sell the MEV back to the user, or it's a very wasteful process if you try to do it. But I think that was like a key motivation for me, at least, in going to something like Uniswap X.
Yeah, I think you can do some things in order to get around the gas cost. So in most MEV boost blocks, you have the builder paying a transaction to the validator already. So you're already incurring like 2,100 gas times base fee worth of cost. And turning that into a smart contract, I think, has the overhead of like 11,000 extra gas or something. There's like a point at which it makes sense in order to, or rather after there are actually cost savings from turning it into a smart contract, and you can like amortize that over many people. Maybe there are other things you can do, so you don't need to pay the user immediately. You can have them claim. There's a broad design space, but I agree that it can be kind of lossy. And yeah, I'm cleaning up your design choices, Dan. So maybe we should talk a little bit more about future design choices.
Clearly.
That's very magnanimous of you, Robert. Very magnanimous. So I guess maybe just then this will lead into being selfish question here because it'll lead into Dan in my next interview. But when you think about a world of intents, and especially there being maybe front ends, right, that sort of collect these intents with entities like market makers on the back that manage some of the complexity. I mean, does that what's the immediate unlock there? Obviously, there's a concern around centralization, but do we also solve some of the cross-chain problems that we've been struggling with for so long in this space? I mean, the bridges seem to be, I don't want to say they're broken. They're definitely a part of crypto that drastically needs to improve, right? Some crazy amount of all of the losses or exploits that happen in DeFi are due to bridge risk. And it does feel like the architecture of something like Uniswap X obviates some of the risk from a user perspective. So I would just be curious, how you all sort of see if intents do get adopted and things like Suave and the whole platform of different OFAs that operate there, or Uniswap X or whatever it is, how does that impact the sort of cross-chain interop, which has been a problem for a long period of time?
I think ideally what you want is users to just express what they want. I have asset A on chain 1, I want asset B on chain 2, and then have a marketplace decide what the best path is and take on risk on behalf of the user for managing things like bridges, managing things like reorgs. And so to that end, I think it could really simplify the user experience. I think beyond that, one thing that is may not be intuitive to readers is that it is oftentimes, as someone who has tried to create an RPC product within a wallet, it can be challenging to offer the kind of experience you want with the way that wallets usually work. And Uma, I think, had a great presentation on trying to create a quote unquote universal RPC at DBA's research day. Specifically, what that was is she was trying to create a way for a user to have an ETH deposit on one chain and have that ETH deposit show up in someone's account balance on a wallet on another chain. And it actually turns out that even if you use an RPC, it is really challenging to fake a user's ETH balance to their wallet or a dApp, even if the balance isn't really fake, it's just on another chain and the RPC is being smart. And if you move to intents, you have a much broader scope, and it is much easier to offer interesting product experiences to users, like doing this product that Uma was trying to make, where you have ETH on one chain that is paying, that is used to pay for a user's transactions on another. So domain abstraction in some way, and getting out of the constraints that developing within wallets and normal dApps put on you today.
Well, guys, maybe we can. I know we're winding down here. Maybe we can leave it there. Robert and Xin, you've both been super generous with your time. For folks who want to find out more about either the two of you, follow you, or find out what you're building at Flashbots or Uniswap, what's the best way to do that for both of you?
Bert C. Miller on Twitter, flashbots.net, if you're interested in reading more about Flashbots.
Yeah, I'm Xin __1 WAN on Twitter. And then some of our papers got put onto our blog.
Thanks. Well, this was a ton of fun, and thank you both again. All right, Dan. Great episode.
What an episode.
Yeah. I was really excited about this one in particular. We referred back to it a whole bunch, but the season with Hasu ended. One of the big questions that we were asking ourselves was general versus application specific order flow auctions. So it was really fun to get Xin and Robert on and represent sort of both sides there. I thought, I don't know if you had any specific takeaways or where you kind of wanted to start, but I thought where we started just in terms of sort of the market size of a general order flow auction and sort of this aggregator of more arbitrary, broad-based sort of intents versus something that's a little bit more swap specific. Love to maybe like get into. I had some takeaways about the specific pros and cons of each approach, but wanted to get your take.
When you think about it, Ethereum runs an order flow auction. Ethereum runs an auction for transactions getting included. And they picked, for a while it was this priority gas one. I think with sort of the rise of proposer builder separation and EAP 5059, you've added other elements into it. But there are, ultimately you do have to order all these transactions and decide which ones get included. And so, I often talk about how, and in this episode talked a little about how generalized auctions are with generalized computations are incredibly hard to do. Unfortunately, we kind of have to do one if we have a generalized platform. We have Ethereum. So right now, and we started with sort of the sort of more naive versions that miners were running about just what transactions to include, and then it got more sophisticated with the Flashbots auction and with proposer builder separation. But like ultimately, you're going to have some kind of way of deciding what transactions gets included. So really, what it's about is how do we return the MEV more to the users. But that said, I think so that's one direction in which to come at this problem is sort of from the protocol up and think about like we've got to build these blocks, how we're going to build them. The other way is from the application down and say like we've got Uniswap has this transaction. What are we going to do with it? They have this user intent. They want to give the user the best possible price. And there again, I think you actually do get a lot of advantage from just getting very specific and saying we're going to build this application around the idea that we might want to run an auction for this particular piece of this order flow. And that's why, again, I think Uniswap X is designed in order to make this the user intent a little more tractable as an object for that kind of auction.
Yeah, I tend to agree. It's almost like it's like auctions all the way down, or that meme where it's like it's all auctions, always has been. There's you start to see them everywhere. I do think as well, there are returning to this theme that we've had throughout the season of reducing leakage outside of the DEX ecosystem. There has really been one auction in town for a long time, which has been the MEV Boost, right? Or let's just call it like the block space or execution level auction.
Right.
And as such, a lot of the value has been getting distributed to ETH validators. But now what we're sort of essentially saying is there's going to be this second auction that's run almost upstream of that, and a lot of that is going to redirect value another way, right? And there's kind of an auction for swaps where price discovery happens, but you can also, it's just a way to redirect value and keep it within the DEX ecosystem.
That's right. Now, as a mechanism designer, I do think there's a lot of advantage. Or I find it easier to start from really the simplest application, and I think this is why I think I've tended in thinking about these auctions to think about them as and primarily from a DEX lens and think how do we make a DEX that works like this, because building an auction that supports arbitrary computation and arbitrary intents and desires to front run and back run these transactions, etc., is just incredibly hard to express all those kinds of preferences and actually be able to meaningfully aggregate across many different people's preferences, including this infinite dimensional computational space. Whereas an intent to trade on a DEX, while very complex, and there are whole textbooks written about how difficult it is to actually design this system properly. It is certainly much more compact of a thing and more tractable of a thing, I think, than the general problem, and still has all the same. You'll end up hitting all those same problems if you build the more general solution anyway. So that's why I've tended to try to think about these from a DEX lens. That's also just where I'm coming from.
I have this framework that I inherited from my days doing consulting, but it's this guy who owned this company used to preach this. It was like focus, simplicity, speed. It was like business focus, process, simplicity, speed. And I actually remember there was a point where I was paying a lot of attention to the Aave strategy versus compound. And it seemed like for a while, they had this sort of divergence where the compound strategy was to focus on, instead of being like, all right, actually, to explain Aave, the Aave perspective is kind of like, we want this to be a marketplace where you can pledge any kind of collateral, like borrow, lend, any type of collateral, spin that up. Whereas the compound strategy was, people just want to borrow and lend in USDC. Look at what's been happening with stablecoins, and we're going to be the most capital efficient venue for borrow lending of stablecoins. And I do wonder if there's a little bit of an element there with what we're discussing with these auction sort of venues, where it's like, look, it could be like a broader, display of things, but if it's mostly swaps, maybe we we start and focus with
Yeah,
swaps.
and we've talked about this before in the context of like DEX design, that you have some number of complexity points you can add maybe every year, and you have to be very just stingy with them. And that's why, and Uniswap V1 started with an incredibly simple design. V2 only makes it slightly more complicated, and then some certainly steps up in V3 and V4. But I think you don't try to go all the way to like we're going to be as complex as current centralized exchange infrastructure is today. That said, I do think there's a lot of value, so conceptually often, in generalizing or abstracting, really, because when you look at a problem at the specifics of a problem, sometimes it can help to say like, okay, what would be like the fully general solution, general version of this problem, and then what's a fully general solution to that? And often it will then, once you've generalized it, you will actually see this is more similar to a problem I've encountered in a different domain. So I do think there's again, here we're just sort of getting into maybe tactics and just in trying to like invent mechanisms like this. But sometimes it can be useful, I think, to just go as hard toward generalization as you can early on, just to explore and see, oh, does that actually unlock something that you wouldn't have noticed in the individual simple case?
Yeah, I think the other bull case for a more general design like a swab would be theoretically more sources of order flow, right? Like if it's a sort of a neutral platform where you can spin these auctions up, then you theoretically have more access to order flow. You could build more profitable blocks, and there'd be a flywheel that goes in that direction as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have access to a lot of more liquidity, because all that liquidity, a lot of liquidity is like locked up in complex things on chain or off chain that potentially could be expressed in a swap auction in a way it may not be in a simple like batch DEX auction.
Yeah, I agree with that. What did you think about? I mean, there was a lot of discussion. Little tense discussion too, but we love that about the on-chain versus off-chain component and the centralizing. And I'm sure you've thought about this quite a bit. And to be honest, I do empathize with Robert's perspective a bit, where it's like, look, if the answer is just to do this off chain, then what are we really doing here? On the other hand, I think to myself, I mean, does it really make sense? Like when we have trillions and trillions of dollars on chain, and that's the vision that I see here, and that's where I want crypto to go. Does it really make sense that the people that are participating in these auctions are like retail people? Like, do we have to be designing this in such a way that it's like retail people that are participating in these incredibly sophisticated, very high stakes finance auctions? And kind of like, I don't think so. Gut intuition would tell me my mom's not going to be participating in that auction. So, I guess that's where I come down.
So I will say, I think there's a lot of questions wrapped up in there. And one distinction I want to draw is that on-chain doesn't necessarily mean more decentralized. What goes on chain? Well, for example, in a protocol like Ethereum right now, what goes on chain is whatever the proposer wants to go on chain. So certainly an auction, for example, suppose you were to hold an English auction on chain where everybody put their bids in, a one block English auction on chain. That's not a secure auction, and it's not a decentralized auction, because ultimately the proposer will censor everyone else's bids, and they'll be the only ones to get included, right? In some ways, I think a lot of off-chain infrastructure can actually be more decentralized, because it doesn't actually it doesn't have this dictatorial control by a current proposer. So I want to draw some distinctions there, where like on-chain doesn't necessarily mean more decentralized. But yeah, I also think this. What you said there is true as well. That I think this goes back to some of the tension between professionalization and amateurs that we were talking about, where like some kinds of designs may depend more on the existence of or benefit people who are more professionalized parties. And I think that that's true in MEV, it's true in DEX, and I think it does it introduces certainly vectors for centralization potentially, but also I think it introduces in addition to a lot of efficiency gains, which you mentioned, it actually introduces sometimes more decentralization, because often you can actually get a lot of the work done that you need to get done sort of by this abstract market. A market in some senses can be very decentralized. Whereas I think in other systems, you sort of, when you're depending on the alternative often is like you end up with like one party that can do it. Again, I think MEV is a perfect example. We have a single proposer for a particular block.
Yeah. And there are all these examples. Finance is a little bit like, I mean, it's like other regulated, like healthcare in a weird way. It's analogous because it's very sophisticated, the work that gets done there, and it's very crucial to people's lives, right? Like if you mess up something in healthcare, people die. And if your banking system goes kaput, then there are enormous and immediate consequences to that. So yeah, there is a required level of sophistication that does get a little bit more. I'm not defending non-permissionlessness. I'm just stating it's a complicated problem. Now, what did you think about the question of just how do you run a credibly neutral auction? I've heard you talk about this before. I know some of the people in the Flashbots community like to discuss it. There's in Cosmos, there's this idea of vote extensions, which sort of allow you to on-chain run this credibly neutral auction because you can't be censored by whoever has the monopoly on constructing the next block. So, I mean, I'd love to get like your sense of like how you think about hosting a credibly neutral auction. What goes into that?
I believe the families of solutions that I've seen, I think it's relevant for the MEV boost auction. It's relevant for order flow auctions like Uniswap X. It's relevant for for batch auctions, for a lot of things. I think the families of solutions I've seen often involve, so one family would be involving some kind of consensus process, right? And I think that might include like threshold encryption. It might or it might just be something like vote extensions in Cosmos, where instead of just having one proposer contributing to a block, you have a lot of different people, and you need 2/3 of them or something to submissions from 2/3 of them to construct a single block. And that can be used, for example, in vote extensions in Cosmos is a mechanism for implementing this. That's one way to try to say, okay, a message will only be censored if like 2/3 of validators of this whole set are censoring. So it's sort of like going from a single sig to a multi-sig in terms of security or censorship resistance on the single block level. So that's one family there. And I think you can improve that sometimes by adding like threshold encryption, where also people can't see the orders that they're including. And there are other ideas about how to do that, but that's one family. Another is to use trusted execution environments, which is one that Robert was talking about. And I think there are limitations as well on what you can actually guarantee with that, but that's trusted hardware, Intel SGX, something like that. And then the third one, which isn't always possible, is just after the fact detection and punishment of someone. And again, I think many times, as Robert pointed out, I think that's just not feasible, and people can actually, and Shen mentioned, you can sometimes get away with just abusing auctions like that. The auctioneer can, with that, it's tough to detect. But I think that's it's another tool in the toolbox, is if you sort of just like look after the fact to see if these auctions were executing a fair price or something, then and then punish or disqualify and move on from the auctioneer if it doesn't work.
You know what? I was just laughing about that anecdote that Robert told us was so great, because there's so many brilliant people in this space, yourself, researchers, the people who really focus on mechanism design, and there's all this emphasis on how can we avoid coordinating parties on chain, all that stuff. And here people are just hopping into Discord, like openly colluding. It was just
collusion resistant infrastructure is kind of impossible. I think that's just sort of unsolvable, unfortunately. And I think the main thing to do is to lower the barrier to entry. And ultimately, I think that, from what I understand, once that I don't know if I'll call it a cartel, but is it a cartel? Maybe it's a cartel. Once that group of coordinating searchers got large enough, I think from what I've heard, at some point it collapsed, and now the ARB is a lot more efficient. So ultimately, I think what matters is, let's just make the markets more and more efficient, so that it's not possible to there aren't such a small number that they can actually collude in that way. But yeah, I agree. It is troubling.
It's tough. It's a tough problem, and
I think that's a challenge for auction, like a big challenge for auction-based MEV solutions, or auction-based sort of anything.
Yeah, it was maybe to just describe we talked about winner's curse and adverse selection, but it's funny that Robert immediately launched into this anecdote, because in a common value auction where you have winner's curse, the ideal strategy to deal with that is collusion. And winner's curse, this idea, just to be like very explicit about what this is, right? When there's a common value auction where like a swap, right, is the same value for everyone's kind of running these different calculations on what that's worth. The reason there's adverse selection there is because, someone who just might not be as smart as pricing might think, they might just bid something that's kind of a stupid price. They're actually bidding something that's more exceeds the value of the swap, but they'll continue to win and win and win. And that's the sort of adverse selection there. Yeah. So
the other solution there is to shade your bid. And I think ultimately it's just to lower your bid, because you might be wrong. But yes, I think that is a it comes up all the time. Also, once you start looking at things in winner's curse terms, yes.
Well, the history of it is it was in 1971. It was like
oil and gas.
It was oil and gas.
Rights, I think. Yeah.
Some economists ran this study on why consistently in this area, like these companies just kept going bankrupt after they won these deals. And it was like, oh, well, they weren't bidding in a particularly sophisticated way. So they kept winning the bids, but then they'd go bankrupt and have to capitulate
But if they collude to coordinate the bids, then then they might they'll probably face some antitrust problems. But they also it could potentially escape that where they just share information with each other ahead of time. I also, just one funny irony is, one thing we're building here is coordination infrastructure, and coordination done by your enemies is collusion. So people can use blockchains often in order to actually coordinate this kind of action. So I think that it's an irony here that you're building the same tools often can be used in order to cheat the mechanisms you're trying to build.
Okay, let me ask you. I've never asked your opinion on this. There was a great, I forget, someone tweeted this out, but like I'm paraphrasing here, but it's like the solution to MEV is that, if you do illegal things, you go to jail. I was like, oh boy, yeah. I mean, there probably is some element of that that's true. And I guess I just, in hearing you describe like collusion is always going to occur, especially in these permissionless systems. If it's not illegal, people just do it right out in the open on like an official Discord channel. I mean, how does the law, start to get factored into these systems? Like, as a mechanism designer, how do you think about that?
I think there are things that come up before the law, and I've been thinking about this recently a lot, like reputation, and some degrees of trust. Where, I think some things that just, if you tried to design them as a game that would work with just totally anonymous in a one-shot game with totally anonymous parties, it's sort of just impossible. Like there are, you could like prove that actually there's no way to make this system actually work. Sometimes it takes a very small sprinkling of some other incentives like reputation or trust or legal incentives to just shift it into an entirely different equilibrium, and actually there is a solution. And so I do think part of what blockchains are is you want to leverage some amount of trust. And I think we call this often like the social layer, right? It's some amount of subjective, like, we have to make as a society, a group, whatever, we're gonna have to make one like decision every few years about like, do we hard fork the blockchain or not? Something like that. You leverage that small amount of social coordination and trust, which is very expensive, and we don't want to have too much of it, to get like a lot more all this like decentralized stuff. And I think that's just generally true. Is sometimes you can get, sometimes you do want to fall back ultimately on some sanction like that, like reputation or trust, or again maybe legal ones as well. But the leverage on it is quite high. And I think one example of that, I think, is like, what it would be really, imagine you could, we end up with like trillions of dollars on Ethereum, right? Like what would happen if somebody tried to like, to 51% attack it, or 67% attack it, and like they could like steal everything on Ethereum, right? It's like the answer is like probably they wouldn't get away with it. Like ultimately you'd be able to steal something, but you wouldn't be able to steal all of that. And so Ethereum doesn't necessarily have to be worth like 2/3 of all the value secured on it or whatever for the whole system to work, because ultimately like we have these fallback mechanisms, and I see law as one of those. It's like it's enough of a deterrent that it shouldn't actually have to be used.
I think that's a good point. I would push back just a tiny bit. I'd be curious to get I'll make the reputation, because I don't know. I mean, there are all these examples in history where that has sort of fallen down, and it was like just to give you an example of like organizations that cheat. Solution: not everyone in the organization has the same incentives. This happens over and over in finance and banking, right? Where you have like hotshot trader takes too much risk, because the calculation for hotshot trader is, hey, if I have two like bang up years, I could pull, if you're a Solomon Brothers in the 80s, you could pull like $10-20 million out of it, and then I could leave. But for Solomon Brothers, it's like, if you put me in bad enough positions, this could bankrupt the whole firm. Different sets of incentives within an organization. So I hear you on the reputation, but I've also always like push back on it. I'd push back.
I fully agree, and that's why I work in crypto. It's a big part of why I focus specifically on decentralized exchange, because I think one such party that has betrayed their trust often, or type of party, is centralized crypto exchanges. And so I think it's an incredibly important thing to minimize trust there. But again, I think ultimately sometimes you need like a drop of this in some place or another, ideally at areas where it's not like fatal to the system necessarily, and ideally at areas where it can be detected to get more leverage.
So maybe to just wind down here and get into tease the idea of our next episode a little bit. But one thing that I was curious about on something like even like Uniswap X, which leverages a little bit more off-chain infrastructure today, is there a path to maybe like when you have something like Anoma or something like that, or a more general purpose framework and blockchain that supports this sort of intents first, just so to speak? Like, do you sort of see a future where maybe the stuff that's off chain today becomes on chain in the future? And there is sort of this pattern in history. Like you bring up centralized exchanges. Okay, well, in the beginning, a decentralized exchange made absolutely no sense because Ethereum didn't exist and we had no infrastructure for that. Over time, centralized infrastructure paved the way, but now DEXs are making headway against even centralized exchange volumes. So there's sort of this pattern of like, okay, in the beginning, you probably need a centralized organization, which is a little bit more command and control, more structured, like an executive branch, to make some of these decisions. But then over time, it does tend to decentralize in crypto. Do you see a path? Anything that you can share about that? Do you see that happening for Uniswap X too?
I think in my view, like one of the most decentralized systems is a market. If we can design a market where people are, that's actually competitive, then I think like you actually end up with often a lot of good outcomes. And so I see, yeah, exactly. You sort of want to move from maybe a system where you need to depend on more trust on certain parties to act, to one where, yeah, exactly, like it's sort of this house of cards like won't fall down because everybody's actually holding each other together, and there's an efficient market that's been bootstrapped out of it.
This next episode, Dan and I are going to go a little bit more into intents and also just how cross-chain DEXs can work, and that'll be a really fun one. But for now, this was a ton of fun, Dan. I will see you all next week.